Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I think this is the last talk in this track before lunch, so hopefully I can keep everyone entertained so you won't notice your stomachs growling. So this is, but it wasn't a rock, it was a BlackBasta. And if you're a B-52s or Family Guy fan, you'll catch that reference, and if not, I just sound like a weirdo, and that's okay. So I'm Josh Murchie. I'm a senior threat analyst at Mandiant, now part of Google Cloud. A little bit of background on me. Actually came from a non-traditional security background. I was active duty Air Force. I did aircraft avionics maintenance. I was told that I would work on computers on airplanes, and that wasn't entirely untrue. But I had the opportunity to switch into security, and so the military trained me up, and I've been on blue team roles pretty much ever since. So in the past 7 years, done the typical blue team thing, SOC analyst, incident response, threat hunting. You get the gist of that. And then about a year ago, I transitioned over to Mandiant, where I'm kind of filling a pure threat intel role now. So my team provides threat intelligence support to the incident response consultants that Mandiant has, as well as our managed defense SOC service. So anytime they have questions or we can kind of help enable them to do better threat-informed defense, that's kind of where we sit, right, is in between them and then the corpus of all of the Mandiant threat intelligence. Quick disclaimer, usual thing, opinions expressed in this content are my own, not necessarily Mandiant, now part of Google Cloud. And then a quick motivational quote. No, not really. There's quite a bit of public reporting out there about BlackBasta. When I sat down and started looking through, what was out there and kind of our own body of intelligence information, sometimes, no vendor has 100% coverage of a certain threat group or a certain threat within, kind of that's out there in the wild. So nothing in this presentation should necessarily be construed to, dispute any other claims by any other vendors out there. This is how we see it, right, at Mandiant, based on the evidence that we have available. Other vendors have different evidence, so they're going to see things differently. All right, real quick, we're going to talk about the history of BlackBasta. We're going to level set on some terminology, make sure that we're using the same kind of words and that we understand each other. We'll talk about how they gain initial access, some of the TTPs that they've employed over time. This is kind of the meat and potatoes of where we'll spend our time today. And then we'll kind of pull out of being in the weeds. We'll talk about where they are now and some conclusions and takeaways. So the history of BlackBasta. Well, what the heck is a BlackBasta? You might have wandered in here and you have no idea what we're talking about. So BlackBasta is a ransomware group, much like most of the other ones out there. In kind of today's climate, they favor the double extortion method of operations. So back in the day, right, ransomware would encrypt your files, and obviously the intent would be, hey, pay us money, you'll get your files back. Well, now double extortion operations really kind of center on, hey, we encrypted your stuff, and you probably want it decrypted, but also we stole all of your data, and if you don't pay us, we're going to leak it. And so BlackBasta is just a double extortion ransomware group that notably came on the scene back in 2022, about April-ish, right? And so this is an excerpt from Bleeping Computer, where they were talking about a particular victim organization that you can totally figure out who that is. I just didn't want to kick them while they're down. Was hit by what was at the time the new BlackBasta ransomware, and that was on April 26, 2022. Notably, on the exact same day, Malware Hunter team tweeted on Twitter, because that's what it was back then, that a completely different victim organization had also been published on BlackBasta's data leak site. But notably, they mentioned that that particular organization was already at 100% published status. So if you've never been to any of these data leak websites, you've never hopped on Tor and just kind of taken a little peek, generally what will happen is once the ransomware groups completed their encryption event and stolen your data, they'll start to post on their personal little blog, right, their data leak website, or sometimes called like a name and shame website, that particular organization's been pwned, and that's how they kind of start putting the screws on that organization to consider paying them so that they can stop all the negative publicity that can come from organizations like Bleeping Computer or Malware Hunter team kind of trolling these things and talking about it. So why that's noteworthy, right, is realistically to get put on the leak site, that's going to happen after they've completed their operation. They're not going to post on there when they're in the middle of doing their thing, crawling around in the victim's network. And then on top of that, there's usually some sort of a lag time where they'll allow the victim the opportunity to engage with them and potentially pay the ransom, before they dump all the data that they have. So realistically speaking, this intrusion was probably completed maybe middle of April, early April, just kind of depends on how quickly they kind of turned and how quickly or how much time they gave the victim to engage with them and pay the ransom or not. So when we talk about when BASTA came on the scene or started kind of conducting intrusion operations, realistically, we're talking about probably middle of April, early April, 2022. And then notably, additional public reporting from near the end of August says that BlackBasta has hit and brought down 50 organizations globally. So do a little bit of math with me. August is about 4 months from April. So 50 organizations in 4 months, that's a pretty impressive pace of operations in general. And then we'll get into this later, but what's more impressive about this is that for a bulk of the summer, they were actually on summer vacation and weren't conducting intrusion operations. So we're realistically talking about 50 victim organizations, maybe in the span of about 2 months. Yeah, I mean, you hate to give credit where credit's due, but that's pretty rapid, right? So there's some additional reporting. Now we've kind of moved forward. We're talking about the end of Q2, Q3. Trend Micro put out that BlackBasta has hit 101 different organizations in a 6-month period. Okay, well, so the last reporting we just looked at was the end of August. Now we're talking Q3 ends, end of September. Now we've gone from 50 to 100. There's probably a little bit of fuzzy math in there, but again, now we're talking about 50 organizations in the span of a month. So definitely a group that was being characterized at the time for how rapid and how successful they would be for being a relative newcomer on the ransomware scene. So where do we sit right now, right? We're a year out from that. So from the 100 organizations that Trend Micro was reporting, where are we now, October 2023? We're tracking at least 300 plus alleged victim organizations. A lot of that stems from the data leak website that they run, which you kind of have to trust the threat actors to tell you the truth. And that's not always the case, so it's kind of a fuzzy number. A lot of times what they'll do as well is they'll pull a victim down and then they'll re-upload them with a slightly different name. Maybe they added like ink or something to the end of their spot on the site. So it makes kind of deduplicating some of the victims a little bit more problematic as well. But either way, 300 victim organizations in about 18 months is quite incredible. And so Mandiant's responded to about 39 different BASTA-related intrusions. And of those 39 intrusions, we've seen 21 different industry verticals that have been impacted. So this is a ransomware group that does not really seem to discriminate, doesn't have a particular interest in any given industry. They'll go after whoever, whenever they can. They're just in it for the money. So what's in the name, right? We're going to have a little bit of terminology discussion. I promise it'll be brief, so bear with me. Mandiant uses the nomenclature an uncategorized or UNC threat group when we're talking about clusters of cyber criminal activity. And so we use that just to join kind of discrete pieces of evidence together so that we can describe like, hey, this is all like related activity. If you're familiar with Microsoft's old naming convention, they used the moniker like dev and then a number, right? And so dev stood for developing. Just the same thing where UNC will be attached with a number that increments up over time. So we've got like UNC 4393 would be one cluster, UNC 3973 would be another. Within the ransomware ecosystem, ransomware as a service has really kind of risen in popularity. So you have RAS operators and RAS affiliates. Operators generally are the ones writing the ransomware, who are coding it, building in capabilities. A lot of times they're also developing toolkits that'll go along and play into usage of the encryptors. And generally they're the ones operating the shaming websites. In some cases they'll handle ransom negotiations, in others the affiliates will handle the ransom negotiations, which leads us into the affiliates. The affiliates are the actual ones conducting the intrusions, right? This is anybody who's partnered with the operator and said, hey, I want your encryptors. And they said, cool, here's the encryptors, go forth and pwn organizations. And so the affiliates will conduct the actual intrusions, and then in exchange, they will pay the operators a portion of the profit if the victim pays. Now, all of that to say, the traditional method of kind of ransomware operations was just that a given ransomware group would make their own encryptor, right? And they would be the ones to also conduct the operations. This is basically just a methodology where they've kind of split out some of the responsibilities. And then also, it's important to kind of start talking about distribution clusters because that's going to come in pretty importantly here in a little bit. Distribution clusters are threat groups who solely specialize in getting your systems infected, right? They have no interest in playing around in your environment. They're not going to ransom you themselves. Their job is to work with potential ransomware groups or ransomware affiliates and just get some sort of a foothold in your environment and then pass that off. Kind of similar to the concept of an initial access broker, but distribution clusters are more focused on like phishing, or if you've heard in the news, like the search engine optimization poisoning that's been going on. So you go and search for like Steam installer or whatever, right? Whatever legitimate piece of software that you're interested in, you get served an ad. That ad actually points to the non-legitimate software that you were looking for. You run that binary and then, now you're infected. So that was all the work of the distribution cluster. Generally what would happen after that, if you were infected, is going to be attributed to a different cluster that paid the distribution cluster for that access. All right, so Mandiant has observed BASTA ransom events attributed to two separate clusters, UNC3973 and UNC4393. UNC3973 was clustered in early summer 2022, so that kind of lines up with the public reporting that we saw. And notably, they successfully ransomed a managed service provider and were able to subsequently manage customers of that managed service provider and leverage that highly privileged access to impact the downstream customers. Outside of that, this particular cluster really hasn't done anything extremely noteworthy. They haven't been active since that event. The only thing noteworthy there is to talk about this cluster is that they use kind of a unique antivirus disablement script. But other than that, in the course of building out this research and this talk, there really wasn't anything to talk about for this particular cluster. UNC4393, on the other hand, was also clustered around the same time. So you can see the numbers are kind of incrementing here. So this was clustered after the other group. And they have ransomed multiple industry verticals, multiple victims, and they are the ones that have conducted multiple noteworthy TTPs that kind of form the basis for this talk. Okay, so what's the relationship between these two clusters? We were just talking about ransomware groups and ransomware affiliates and operators. Are UNC3973 and UNC4393 the exact same entity, and we just haven't figured that out? Are they evidence of a ransomware as a service thing kind of going on here with BlackBasta? Like what's kind of the understanding going on here? And the reality is we can't say for sure, right? All we can do is look at the evidence and say, we don't really see any overlap here between these two clusters, which is noteworthy because as we're going through and supporting the Mandiant incident response consultants, when a threat analyst isn't really sure who to attribute a given intrusion to, they'll go ahead and make a new cluster, move on, and then what we'll do in the background, maybe days, weeks, months later, is we'll conduct some kind of retrospective analysis and figure out like, hey, can we collapse these down? Is this actually like, are some of these groups actually the same thing? And UNC4393 is actually the result of collapsing down 9 separate clusters that we observed deploying BASTA ransomware over the past 18 months. So we've done all this research and been able to kind of say like, hey, all of these things are all the same, but UNC3973 is off on their own over here, right, by themselves. And so, we can't really say for sure whether this is, ransomware as a service going on. Maybe BlackBasta potentially just gave their buddy like the encryptor or something, and because they had some cool access to an MSP. Honestly, you could run wild with the hypotheses. All we really know is that UNC4393 continues to be the predominant cluster conducting BASTA ransomware events. All right, initial access. So the rest of this talk is pretty much going to focus on UNC4393. So I'm going to kind of use that synonymously with BlackBasta, even though that may not be completely appropriate, but just kind of bear with me on that. So, bad ransomware actors, how do we stop them? Well, obviously, if we can stop them at the door, that's the best course of action. Well, UNC4393's primary, or let me backtrack on that, not primary, sole method of initial access comes from QuackBot infections. If you're not familiar with QuackBot, that is also called QBot in public reporting. It's a very capable backdoor written in C that is highly modular and includes a lot of different functionality, like being able to intercept emails of infected systems, being able to send emails on behalf of users who are infected, injecting itself into browser sessions, harvesting credentials on infected systems. It's kind of a gnarly piece of malware, very, very capable piece of malware. But what's noteworthy is that not all QuackBot infections necessarily lead to a handoff to a ransomware operator, right? QuackBot kind of operates in a botnet fashion, and so it makes sense that if you want a really robust botnet, you need to continue to grow the botnet. So some of those QuackBot infections they'll sit on those infections and actually use those to phish brand new victims. What do I mean by that? This is my poor attempt at replicating like an email. This is, more or less a real email. A future victim emails someone that they have done legitimate business with. These are two people who potentially know each other professionally, right, and work on some sort of a project together. And the future victim basically emails a unbeknownst to them, compromised user who was infected with QuackBot and says, hey, can you send me that file that we were talking about? Not sure if they were talking about it via email or a phone call, whatever, right? But these are two people who know one another. This is like a trusted party, right? The compromised user never gets that email, and instead the QuackBot operators respond back to that future victim and say, yep, sure thing. Here's the file that you wanted, except it wasn't the file that they wanted. It was a QuackBot payload embedded in a HTML file that the user then subsequently downloaded and ran and infected themselves with QuackBot, and that led to BlackBasta ransomware deployment. Okay, here's another example. This one's a little bit more difficult to illustrate, but basically what's going on here is, president at some company is emailing with a bunch of different of his direct reports, right? They're discussing some very important legal matters with another company, and so there's like lawyers and stuff on this email thread with this other company, right? And this email thread's actually like 25, 30 messages long. Like this conversation's been going back and forth, back and forth. And then out of the blue, this random email address responds back within the email thread and is like, hey, here's the updated agreement, and directed the users to a very sketchy website and provided them the password for a zip file that contained a QuackBot payload. Notably, you'll notice that different company lawyer, right, isn't on the to line anymore. We suspect that the other company was, in fact, infected with QuackBot, and they took them off the to line, right, so as to not tip off the organization that they had already infected that they were, in fact, infected. So, if phishing is the primary way, or excuse me again, the sole way that UNC 4393 is getting into victim organizations, that kind of leads us to, well, we should prevent phishing. How do we do that? If I had the answer to that, I'd have a lot of money and I wouldn't have to give talks at SAINTCON. No, I'm just kidding. I don't want to wade too far into this, right? Fish training and stopping phishing, it's just such a hairy subject to get into. But when we kind of look at the two case studies that we have available on the slides, right? I think that one method that we could potentially be investigating further is just getting back to the basics of computer literacy. And what I mean by that is not to necessarily be patronizing, but the user who received that email back from a user that they, a person that they legitimately do business with, like that's just a hard thing to train for. Like, how do you train your users to be able to know that a message they got back from someone that they do legitimate business with is going to be a phishing email? You can't. But what if we trained users like, hey, yeah, we've talked about EXEs are bad and don't double click EXEs when you get those, but does that user know that they don't generally receive HTML files from other people? Do they know what an HTML file is? I think just getting back to helping users understand the basics of how a computer operates. And admittedly, Microsoft hasn't done us any favors with that by making file extensions hidden by default. But maybe if that user had known hey, I don't really get HTML files from this person. This is kind of weird. I was expecting a PDF. Maybe there was an opportunity there for them to raise their hand and say, hey, something's weird here. It doesn't feel right. But if they literally have no idea what an HTML file is or that that's abnormal for them to receive, then obviously how are they supposed to know? On top of that, I was talking to my wife about this and she had no idea that there's this, I think we as security professionals understand that an email thread's it's just a thing. It's not trusted in any way just because it's a conversation you've been having for 25, 30 messages back and forth. Doesn't mean that you can't get bad stuff sent to you in your email thread. And so talking to my wife, she that concept kind of blew her mind, right? And she was like, wow, I never even thought that somebody could get added into an email thread who might send bad things to us, right? And so I think just general education to not necessarily trust everything just because it was in an email thread. The second case that we saw, right, with the very sketchy website, I didn't include the domain, but it was literal just gibberish characters that should have set off some alarm bells in somebody's mind. And so I was like, how did that even happen? And the only thing that I could think to myself when I was kind of analyzing the situation is just, complacency, because it was an email thread. It wasn't just this rando email that they received unsolicited, which leads me into number 3. Phish training's done a great thing for the industry as a whole, right? We've definitely helped curtail a lot of phishing, but I think the box that we've put, the average user into thinking that all phishing is just going to be an unsolicited email sent to you from like someone masquerading as Amazon with a gift card or DHL, you've missed your package. We've done good to help illustrate those points, but I think we've also put ourselves in a box and put the users in a box, and they don't understand that phishing is a much broader threat vector than just that. All right, TTPs over time. We're going to spend quite a bit of time in here. This is a general timeline of all of the UNC 4393 BASTA-related intrusions that Mandiant is tracking. And so you're going to see here we've got little red pins at the bottom for the respective intrusions where we actually saw them employ a particular TTP. So if you're not familiar with Bloodhound, it's a Active Directory recon tool used legitimately by like red teamers, blue teamers, right? It helps you kind of identify interesting attack paths where attackers can potentially, escalate privileges, or how do I get to domain controllers? How do I get to domain admin? Notably, attackers have figured this out too. They're well aware of Bloodhound. And so UNC 4393 used Bloodhound in 2 separate intrusions, and in both cases saved the output of those, of running the script to the C program data folder. That's going to come into play here in a little bit. We're going to see that quite a lot. Notably, they only used it twice. It kind of seems like they decided that it was really rather low utility for them, and it wasn't providing a whole lot of value. You can also see that it was kind of earlier on in their overall intrusion lifecycle. How can we detect Bloodhound, right? If they hop on a box and deploy Bloodhound, like what's our course of action here? So generally speaking, Bloodhound a lot of times will manifest as SMB scanning. So if you have some sort of a firewall set up, right, to monitor east-west traffic, a lot of times it'll pop a signature from your firewall vendor saying, hey, there's some weird SMB scanning going on here. The problem with that is, in my experience, not a lot of SOCs actually triage like SMB scanning events because, quite frankly, they're very high false positive prone. So the SOC might get them, but maybe they're labeled as a informational severity or a low severity event, and they're probably just going to pencil whip it. So that's unfortunate because this is a legitimately good way of detecting Bloodhound activity. It just kind of gets drowned out with all the other false positives that can crop up within a typical Active Directory environment. So tuning those and kind of maybe getting down into making sure that your SOC analysts aren't experiencing some sort of fatigue related to these types of alerts. And then also I kind of hit on it to begin with. If you're not watching your east-west traffic at all, and piping that information into some sort of a seam, you're going to miss this entirely. Monitoring east-west traffic is super important for catching some of this stuff. I understand not every organization has the resources to do that, and so north-south is going to be kind of primarily where you're going to put your resources, but just putting it out there that this is viable for detection. Also, the concept of like cyber deception and using honeypots has kind of really come into vogue in the past couple of years. So if you create basically a fake Active Directory user or group or machine that has basically no privileges, no function within the legitimate production environment, you'll know that if anything touches that object within Active Directory that, hey, something's off here because this isn't legitimate. Like we don't actually use this. This shouldn't be doing anything. So to do that, you will need to enable some advanced logging within Active Directory on your domain controllers. You'll get a event ID 4662, which will basically be like, hey, this object was accessed. Unfortunately, that is a very, very noisy event ID, so you can really only employ this if you've got your domain controllers resourced enough to enable that throughput of logging. And then again, you need to be piping your logs into some sort of a platform in order to take advantage of this. AdFind is the other tool that they really kind of like to rely on during their recon. So AdFind is similar-ish to Bloodhound, but basically it just does Active Directory reconnaissance. This is a legitimate publicly available tool that some organizations use, in the course of administering their environments. Every time we saw them using ADFind, they were literally naming the files either adfind.exe or af.exe. And then there's that C program data folder again. They really like to drop that into that folder. Occasionally we did see them run it from ctemp. And every single time that they executed ADFind, they ran it with the exact same order of command line parameters and piped the output of the command into C program data or randomly C intel. All right, so how do we detect ADFind? Well, again, kind of the same thing with the honeypots, right? So if someone's going to scan Active Directory and is going to touch potentially every object in Active Directory, we can use our honeypot AD groups users machines to say, hey, something weird's going on here. This machine should not be touching this particular object. And then on top of that, some antivirus software does include the ability to create like custom IOC detections. If you don't legitimately use ADFind within your environment, your sysads aren't using ADFind at all, you can alert or block based on the code signing cert associated with ADFind because it is a legitimate piece of software, it is signed, and so that'll kind of give you a early head start that someone's using ADFind in your environment. And then also that very unique, very specific set of command line parameters being passed to the binary is a really good method of detection if you've got like process event creation events going into your log platform. In fact, the DFIR report has some Sigma rules that kind of detect that exact thing, and I would highly recommend those. Sticking with the theme of recon, like I said, ONC4393 really laid low and did their thing and did some recon in their intrusions. So this is a Nmap-like port scanner written in PowerShell. It's basically what it sounds like. And every time we saw them use it across the 3 intrusions, they were naming it either like ppp.ps1 or quadp.ps1, and they were launching it either from like C users public or the Windows folder. Unfortunately, the command lines they were using when they were invoking it are kind of generic and probably pretty common, so you probably can't detect it based on the command line parameters being passed to the script. But if you do enable and have PowerShell script block logging turned on, you would be able to alert on some of the like function names or maybe some specific strings contained within the script that could alert you that PSN map's being used. As well, since it is basically Nmap, a one-to-many kind of network connection rule that your firewall might have would also be totally valid here. Command and control. So if you pay attention to trends in the industry, you'll know that Cobalt Strike Beacon, #1 choice of threat actors everywhere. So this is, on the left, we've got a little graph just showing how common beacons used in 2022. This is from the Mandiant M Trends report. Unsurprisingly, this particular threat group loved Beacon. I think there's only like 3 pins on the timeline where they weren't using Beacon. And realistically, they probably did. We just didn't get the evidence to support it. And so when we're doing incident response, if we don't see it, we can't say that it happened. So this was nearly ubiquitous in their intrusions. And then kind of going back with the whole Quackbot thing, right? When Quackbot runs and does its thing based on whatever modules were loaded into it when the phish message comes through, we typically saw Beacon get launched and beacon back and call back to the attacker's infrastructure within seconds. So they were in the environments basically right away. So with a tool like Beacon, like how do we detect that? And obviously that's hopefully the role that your antivirus software is going to play and be the most efficiency with that, right? But if you're looking to do some defense in depth and you're like, okay, well, sure, I've got some AV, hopefully it'll catch Beacon, what else can we do? We specifically noticed that this threat group liked to use DLLs with .txt and .xlsx extensions, and they were generally launching the DLLs out of C users public. So if you're unfamiliar, DLL usually ends with .dll. So to see those abnormal file extensions getting loaded with run DLL32 is pretty abnormal. And then on top of that, they really liked the .icu TLD for some reason. And then I think that they were employing some sort of a domain generation algorithm because we consistently saw as they were using domains across all these different intrusions, that a lot of them have these weird subdomain naming conventions like aaa.h.dns or this weird string like rydaj4 plus a bunch of alphanumerics. So some interesting subdomain naming conventions going on that helped us kind of pinpoint and track some of this activity. So then how can you leverage that for your detections within your environment? Well, again, Run DLL32 calling a .txt file. That's probably not the most common thing in your environment. Obviously, you do some threat hunting and check that, but abnormal file extensions being loaded by run DLL32 is definitely something that we should be monitoring for. And then also, we keep hitting on C program data, C users public. There's some peculiar folders that these binaries are running out of. Depending on what your users are doing, how your systems are configured, maybe that's perfectly normal for you, maybe it's not, in which case you've got a totally valid method of detection for binaries launching out of abnormal folders. Now, obviously, I'm not advocating for alerting on any binaries executing off a user's desktop or a downloads folder. You're going to get a whole bunch of alerts if you do that. But we can look at some of these other less common ones, like typically users aren't navigating to the program data folder because it's hidden by default. So just something to think about. And then also the DNS subdomains, right? You can monitor for DNS lookups to weird TLDs. Quite frankly, how many of your users in the course of doing legitimate business are accessing websites on .ICU TLDs? Probably not a lot. Again, do some threat hunting, double check that, make sure you're not gonna DOS your users, but definitely something that we can look out for. And then System BC. I could do an entire talk separately about System BC. This is a really interesting piece of malware. Basically, it's a tunneler that proxies the C2 traffic for Beacon over a custom binary protocol over TCP. They definitely started to take a liking to this kind of middle to the late half of their intrusions. And so when we saw them implementing System BC, they were generally executing it either as a standalone binary or as a DLL. And then again, you can see they really have some predilection for certain folders, C program data, C Windows, C users public. You're kind of noticing a trend here that this particular threat actor does have some not nuance, sorry. That's the word I'm looking for. Anyway, basically they have some favorite directories to execute out of. And then as far as detection, basically everything we talked about with Beacon, this one's a really difficult thing to detect because it's basically just a tunneler utility. So hopefully your antivirus is able to catch this, but it goes along with weird binaries executing out of weird directories. And then for persistence, they really like to use remote management and monitoring software. So most organizations probably use some sort of an RMM solution within their environment. AnyDesk, Atera, SplashTop, you see the list on the screen. They've used all of those. These are all publicly available, legitimate RMM tools. Generally, they would save the tool to C program data, C Del, or C Windows Temp is where they kind of like to drop these. And then they made no real attempt to masquerade or hide the binaries. They were literally named anydesk.exe or splashtop.exe. So how can we detect this? Well, if your organization isn't using a particular RMM solution, you should probably be alerting on or blocking any binaries that execute for other RMM solutions. That's not just for this, but realistically, that's a good way to kind of cut back on some shadow IT. And so, looking at those code signing certs on those binaries, because again, it is legitimate software, it is signed, that's something that you could look at. Again, back to the theme of binaries executing in unlikely directories. And then most of those tools, like AnyDesk in particular comes to mind, need to kind of call back to the AnyDesk service to a relay server in order to tell the mothership hey, this is where I am, so that the end user can connect to that device. So if you have RMM solutions that you're not using, you can go look those things up. They're generally publicly documented because for the people who are going to use them, they need to make sure that those domains and IP addresses aren't being blocked. So you can go look up and say, hey, what are the AnyDesk relay domains? Because we don't use AnyDesk. All right, I've got all these domains. Let's black hole those on our internal DNS servers, right? And so that's one that I would highly recommend. As well, because these are legitimate pieces of software and this isn't malware, they do typically write to the registry, and they'll write registry keys that include SplashTop or AnyDesk in the name. So if you've got some sort of a capability for monitoring the registry, looking for those strings in your registry creation events would be ideal. All right, we blazed through that. I'm sorry, there was a lot to cover. So where are they now? Well, so if you were paying attention to the news, or excuse me, let me back up here. So I alluded to earlier that the Quackbot operators and Basta take a summer vacation. Well, so that kind of makes sense, right? If Basta heavily relies on Quackbot for initial infection. If the Quackbot operators, the people who operate the Quackbot botnet, take a summer vacation, that means that their intrusion operations are likely going to slow down. And that's exactly what happens. The Quackbot operators have, for the past several years, taken a summer break, because when you pull in as much money as they do, you can do that. And so this particular year, they actually, Quackbot kind of ceased operations around the end of June. And then when they would have probably been spinning back up operations and coming back from their hiatus in whatever warm, sunny country that they were visiting, they were met with the fact that the Department of Justice, in conjunction with several other foreign law enforcement agencies, had conducted a massive takedown effort on the Quackbot botnet. So they came back to work to find out that everything literally was on fire. So that's a good thing, right? If Quackbot gets shut down and Quackbot's kind of like reeling from being hit by the Department of Justice, that means that Basta is probably doing the same thing, right? Because they're heavily reliant on Quackbot for initial infection, so they're pretty much out of the picture. Well, unfortunately, not quite. So Mandiant's observed that UNC 2500, which is just one of the Quackbot operators, yes, Quackbot got shut down, but really their jam is phishing. Quackbot just happened to be the tool that really enabled them to take advantage of their phishing skills. And so they've actually already pivoted over into using different malware families called Darkgate, Picabot, and Snowcone. So we've already observed that these actors, sure, they were shut down maybe for about a month, but they've already switched over to running new malware, and they're already conducting new phishing campaigns. Also, I kind of lied at the beginning just because things changed so much in the threat environment. So UNC 4393, the last we had seen them initially was kind of in May-ish. Well, they're back. So kind of goes hand in hand with the Quackbot operators coming back. But literally just a couple weeks ago, we created a new cluster to track deployment of Basta ransomware at 3 separate organizations. In all 3 of those cases, the victims were infected via a phishing email that came from a prior Quackbot operator now using Darkgate. And we were able to look at all of the evidence rapidly before I had to give this talk, because I wanted to be able to give the most up-to-date information. But basically, we were able to confirm, yes, these TTPs match up. This is, in fact, them. They're back. And so here's just a kind of another little timeline plot, right? If we kind of mapped in their new, the 3 new intrusions that we see. And so we see that gap, and now they're back on the far right. All right, so some conclusions and takeaways. What can we distill down from 37 minutes of me talking about Basta ransomware? So a lot of people were talking about, especially if you're in the Twitter infosec scene, that this past summer was hot 0-day summer. It's easy to focus on 0 days because they're super sexy and whatnot, but phishing still thrives. Phishing lives on. It's still working. Threat actors are still going to lean on phishing because it's the gift that keeps on giving for them. But also, I thought it was really kind of interesting that doing all this deep dive analysis and kind of really honing in on one singular threat actor, their TTPs more or less don't change. Maybe a tool or here or there will change. Maybe they'll change a directory here or there. But other than that, they stick to the same kind of playbook or patterns, which, given that they know that these types of conferences and these types of talks are going on and that we're watching them and we're monitoring them, I just find that interesting. They either just don't care or they don't think that there's anything to fear from presentations like this, right? Educating the rest of the community about what they have going on. But also, I hope that everybody here was able to see, you can detect pre-ransom activity. It is attainable. It's not all woe is me once you're infected with Quackbot. But also, I hope that you were able to see that attribution of ransomware intrusions is extremely complicated. Nailing down these groups, because they may not care about the TTPs that they employ on the host and us seeing those and talking about those, but they definitely don't want us seeing and peeking behind the curtain of kind of how their actual criminal organization's running, which makes it really difficult to do attribution. And then in that same vein, if you were paying attention to a particular ransomware group, not Basta, that hit a casino over the summer, that ransomware group did not take well to some of the media reporting and other intel reporting that was going on at the time about them. And they wrote a very hotly worded letter to the threat intelligence community and basically called us out and said, hey, you guys don't even know what you're doing. And, honestly, maybe they're right, but I hope that, conferences like SAINTCON and these kinds of talks where we're able to, really give out this information and help, impose cost on the adversaries really kind of changes their understanding of, what we're able to do. And I sped through that. We've got time for questions, if anybody has. Cool. All right, thank you. Enjoy lunch.